Hi there, it's Mary, and today's tutorial is how to make fingerless gloves with a stretchy edge. This pair matches my confetti hat, and you can find that link in the upper right corner, and I'll also link to it below in the description. For today's project, I'm using Big Twist and Speckled Brights and Big Twist Watermelon. You also need some waste yarn. To begin, cast on with waste yarn and knit 5 or 6 rows. Begin by wrapping the yarn around the first needle. Hold the yarn in the hook until that needle drops into the machine. Then weave the yarn behind the next needle and in front of the following needle, alternating between going behind and in front of the needles all the way around. Take your time with this step. If it's not correct, your knitting will unravel. Go ahead and place your yarn into the yarn guide and you're ready to go. Change to the watermelon color at the number 1 needle. Simply cut the waste yarn tail and place it between the last needle and the first needle, and add the watermelon yarn and leave a 15-inch tail. And this tail will be used to close the end of the tube and seam the sides of the glove. So I like to make a little bundle of this long tail so that it doesn't untwist while we're knitting, and it's easy to just clip to the bottom of the waste yarn when I use this clothespin. Reset your counter, and for this section we're going to knit 10 rows. When changing colors, instead of changing between the last needle and the first needle, change between the first needle and the second needle. This will force the color jog into the inside of the glove and won't interfere when seaming the sides together. So to do this, we're going to cut the yarn and leave a small tail. Place the new yarn or the Speckled Brights yarn into the yarn guide, and you want to make sure these tails come out between the first and the second needle. Hold the tails up high so they get caught by the hook. Take a few stitches and then tie a knot in your ends. For this section, knit a total of 30 rows. So change back to the watermelon color, and again we're going to do this between the first needle and the second needle by cutting our yarn and placing it between the first needle and the second needle, adding our new yarn in that same location. Hold the tails high so the hooks will catch the yarn. Take a few stitches and tie a knot. And then for this section, we will knit a total of 5 rows. Before changing to waste yarn, leave a 60-inch tail. Now change to waste yarn between the last needle and the first needle and knit 5 or 6 rows. Again, hold those tails up high under the hook so we don't drop any stitches. So I like to bind off the waste yarn rather than letting it fall off the machine. This way I won't drop any stitches when I'm closing the tube end in the next step. To bind off the waste yarn, cut a longer tail and thread onto a tapestry needle. Pick up one stitch at a time with the needle and pull the yarn through. At the same time, hold the next stitch with your finger or thumb so the stitch does not fall off the machine. Continue to pick up stitches all the way around until the knitting is off the machine. I'll go ahead and give the tube a good stretch and organize the tails. It's time to close the ends of the tube. The cast on edge is the edge where the fingers are, and for this edge we will close the tube using a simple slip stitch technique. Begin by completing the first stitch. Simply weave the tail through the last 2 loops of the waste yarn, then remove the waste yarn from these 2 loops. You can find the detailed tutorial in the link above in the corner, and I'll also link to it below in the description. Now we're ready to do the slip stitch. Not counting the tail stitch, we want to count over half the number of needles from your machine. So I'm using a 46 needle machine, and I will count over 23 stitches from the tail stitch, not including the tail stitch. So I'll insert my needle into that 23rd stitch, then into the next stitch, and pull that through the first stitch. Now going up to the top side of the tube, I'm going to pick up the next stitch and pull it through. Go to the bottom, pick up the next stitch and pull it through. And now simply alternate between the top and the bottom edges, going all the way across. When you reach the end, you can simply pull the tail all the way through. Now you can remove the waste yarn from this end. This is the nice edge that is left when doing this technique. And remember to leave the long tail for seaming the side later. Now to close the opposite end. Because this edge will be up around your arm, the grafting technique will give a nice stretchy edge to fit most arms. Thread the long tail onto a tapestry needle. Starting with the stitch to the right of the tail, go down through the stitch from the front side to the back side and into the next stitch you go from the back side to the front side and pull that stitch through. So the front side is the knit side of the fabric, the back side is the purl side of the fabric. Now on the top side we're going to go down through the tail stitch from the front to the back, and then the next stitch we're going to go back to the front and pull that yarn through. Again, the front side is considered the knit side of the fabric, the back side is considered the purl side of the fabric. Then what we'll do is go back to the bottom side and repeat this, except we're going to go through the previous stitch. So we'll go down through the front of that stitch and up through the back of the next stitch. Now we'll go back to the other side, and again we'll go through the previous stitch. I actually want to go down through that previous stitch and up through the next stitch and pull that yarn through. Alternate between the top side and the bottom side, going down through the previous stitch and up through the back of the following stitch. As you're pulling this yarn through, you want to try and keep your tension the same as the rest of the knitting. So if you look at the stitch length of your main knitted piece, that is the stitch length that we're trying to achieve by doing this grafting. So we'll keep switching from the bottom side to the top side, going through the previous stitch from the front to the back and up through the next stitch from the back to the front. And we'll just do this until we reach the other end. So I'm at my last two set of stitches. I'll go down through the previous stitch and up through the last stitch on the bottom. And then I'll switch to the top and go down through the previous stitch and up through the last stitch on the top. And that will complete the grafting. Now the waste yarn can be removed. To do the side seam, first we want to look for our color jog, and we want to make sure when we fold our tube lengthwise that that color jog is on the inside. Then we'll thread our tail onto a tapestry needle, and I accidentally cut mine a little too short. To start seaming, Insert your needle into the corner of the opposite side and pick up the first 2 bars. And then pull your yarn through. And then switch back to the opposite side and pick up those first 2 bars and pull the yarn through. So continue to go back and forth, seaming this side down for 2 inches, which happens to be the bottom of this first color, the watermelon color. When you go to tighten up this seam, pay attention to that top edge. We don't want to pull too hard that it creates a dimple there. Once you have finished this top section, you'll pull on the yarn just a little bit to snug up that seam. And then instead of making a knot right here, go back to the other side and weave the needle up to the top. Pull on that seam a little bit to make sure it stretches. Then tie a knot hidden in the seam on the inside. Once that is done, I can go ahead and bury that tail. So before we can seam the opposite end, what I like to do is use a couple of stitch markers to identify the same 2 columns of stitches that we used on the opposite end. So once I have identified the column on one side, I will place a stitch marker and then follow that column of stitches on the opposite side down to the corner and place a stitch marker there. And next what I'll do is mark the place that I need to stop doing the seaming by measuring down from the top edge 3 3/4 of an inch. This is where we will stop seaming. Now we can thread our tapestry needle with the long tail and start to seam this opposite end. So to begin, I'm going to go to the opposite side of where my tail is and pick up the first 2 bars. Then switch sides and pick up the first 2 bars on the opposite side. And then just like we did on the other end, we're going to alternate between sides, picking up 2 bars at a time. Once we reach our stitch markers, we can go ahead and remove those. And then continue until we reach our stitch marker that marks the end of our seaming. After a few stitches, I'll go ahead and remove the slack in this yarn by pulling on the tail. Now again, I want to be careful not to pull too hard to create an indent on this edge here. I'm going to watch that carefully and then continue to seam. So once I've reached the stitch marker, I'm going to count the number of stitches for the thumb opening, and I just want to make sure this number of stitches is the same on both sides. When that is finished, I'll go ahead and remove the slack and stretch the seam. I'm going to weave my needle inside, going all the way back up to the top edge. And then I'll make a couple small knots on the inside and then bury the tail. So I'm just going to try this on real quick, and you can see how that grafting technique makes that edge nice and stretchy. Once you have that complete, you just repeat the process from start to finish for the second glove. So I'd love to hear what you think about using the grafting technique for a stretchier finish. Drop a comment below and check out some of my other circular knitting machine techniques, patterns, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.